Greetings and salutations. My name is Derek Taylor, and today I wanted to talk about whips. One of the most common questions I have asked over the years and people have posed to me is, how do you tell if it's the whip not able to do a certain crack or if it's my lack of training? And one of the ways that you can tell is to examine the whip and to make that determination based on a couple of factors. Now, there are two types of things, at least in my mind, that I look at to determine if the whip is a good one or not. And those two things are cosmetic things and performance things. A lot of cosmetic things can turn into performance issues if they're not addressed, but many of the performance issues don't necessarily need to be cosmetic. Some things about a whip that are purely cosmetic are the color choices. If it's got fancy braiding in the handle, if it's got a cool color scheme, that's mostly cosmetic. Color doesn't impact the performance of a whip. So taking this whip and describing some cosmetic issues, there are some places in this whip where the strands weren't dropped perfectly as I wanted it. You can see up here what I mean, where the strand drops are a little bit overlapped or not pulled quite tightly enough, or perhaps a little too tight, and that makes it look perhaps not its best. Also down towards the end of the thong, where I go into, I think, a 6-plat, you can see that on the one side it's got a really tight checkerboard pattern, and on the other side it's more of a V chevron pattern. Neither of those two things really impact the performance of this particular whip. The strand drops are such that it might look a little different, but it doesn't change the way that it moves. Same with the 6-plat. Even though it looks different the one side to the other, it doesn't necessarily affect how it moves. So even though this has some places that I'm not particularly thrilled with, they don't impact the performance of the whip at all. Here I have a 3-foot whip that I made for indoor use and for teaching kids, and it has a cosmetic issue. There's a spot here that the strands weren't plaited properly. There's a strand that was plaited in the wrong sequence, and even though I don't like the look of that, it hasn't changed performance too much. If the whip were to have the dropped strands perhaps pulled too tightly or not tightly enough, that would perhaps cause that strand to have too much tension in that area, or to be too loose and have that strand come up and out of the whip, which would be a big problem. And that would be a part where the cosmetic, something that wasn't a problem, turns into a performance issue. Also, with plaiting too loosely, if the whip were to be plaited too loosely and you were to run your hand down and squeeze and have the strands shift, that would also go from perhaps a cosmetic issue to a performance issue, because it would change the entire tension and the entire braiding style throughout the whip, and it would make it so that the whip didn't function properly anymore. Another cosmetic issue is overall wear on your whip. Specifically, if it's been kind of roughed up, the strands are starting to fray a little bit. That's another point where it looks a little funky, but wouldn't necessarily be anything more than cosmetic, unless the strand wear was really significant, in which case that could lead to a strand breaking, which would really impact the function of the whip. So that leads very well into the performance section of my criteria for determining if a whip can do its job properly. And if all of the flaws in the whip are merely cosmetic and aren't to the point where they would impact performance, the rest can be tested based on how a whip actually performs. Now, a whip is all about transferring energy from the handle down to the end of the thong, into the fall, and finally the cracker. So the main thing that helps with energy transference is a good taper and good tension throughout the whip. There shouldn't be spots where the whip is very, very straight or very tense, and then spots where it isn't. That leads to a lot of kinking and a lot of hitching action. The energy moving through those areas of different tension loses a lot of the momentum that could otherwise be passed on down through the thong into the cracker. So if a whip has good taper, goes from very thick to very thin in a very consistent manner, without any lumps or places where it goes from thick down to very thin, or even worse, very thick to thinner, then to thick again, the whip should be able to transfer energy very well. And that energy transference in a bullwhip can be shown through how it rolls. If the whip has a very good taper, you'll see that the whip starts to form a loop, and then that loop travels all the way down to the end of the thong in this manner. I'll just get this loop started and just gently tip the whip, and you'll see that it starts to move and then has a very consistent circle all the way down. One more time. It just should roll very smoothly down the length of the whip. Now, the rollout test isn't necessarily the only test that you can do to tell if a whip is good or not. For example, I have this whip that I keep in my car for going out on hikes when I don't really care about the conditions the whip is going to be in. Even though it is a very good cracking whip, it has an abysmal rollout. You can see that if I just kind of move like this, it doesn't move down the thong very well at all. And once it does start to move down the thong, it tends to just sort of flop to one side. If the rollout test were the only test you did, this whip would not make the cut. The rollout test also would not do very well on stock whips. Because stock whips have a universal joint connection between handle and thong, that allows for it to curve very tightly. And so if I were to just kind of move the whip so that it would start to roll out, you can see that it just kind of hangs there. If, however, I were to start the loop and then roll it, you would see that it does roll, and does roll really pretty well. But if the rollout test from handle to thong is the only thing that you do, a lot of stock whips wouldn't make the cut between good whip and bad whip either. So the rollout doesn't necessarily show if a whip is good, but it is a good indication, especially with bull whips or braided whips that have good tension from handle to thong. Even better than the rollout technique, once you've determined that the tension in the whip is good, is to test and see, can the whip crack by giving it just enough energy to get extended, and then to perform the crack with only that energy. So in this footage, you can see how little energy I'm putting into the whip motion. It's still getting extended behind me, and then I'm simply rolling my hand forward. I'm not swinging up incredibly strongly or slamming my hand down. but it's just very, very little energy, enough to get extended behind me and then just pushing the whip forward and getting it to crack that way. So if the whip can crack using minimal energy input, you can tell that it's good at transferring energy. And if it cracks just using the minimum to get it extended, the whip is a very good whip, and any flaws are merely cosmetic. From there, you can infer that the tricks that you're trying to do are only a matter of practice, and it's not the whip that is keeping you from fulfilling those particular goals of yours. Now, that is not to say that this is the only way or the only test that you can do, and as you get into more advanced whip cracking and you're looking for very minute differences in whip performance, that this testing method will hold up. But it's a very good testing method for especially beginners to intermediate whip crackers who are wondering if it's them not being able to perform the trick or if it's the whip. And that is my current understanding. I hope this video helps answer some questions, and as always, I will keep you updated with my progress and other things that I learn along the way. I appreciate you sticking with me through this, and I'll see you on my next adventure. So that's my hairstyle. I appreciate you sticking through me. Let's try that again. Oh, brother.